Hi everybody, this is Brazy. Welcome to a Speak Your Truth video blog. Holden, Qantas, people want to get rid of them. People think it's no big deal. Who cares? We'll just create some other car company and we'll just create some other airline, or we'll just let other people from overseas come in. You know, I saw a police car the other day and it was like a Corolla or something. I started to think to myself, on my push bike, I could probably outrun these guys. And what scared me the most is I believe it's part of a much larger plan by the globalists to literally erode the sovereignty of nations. And in this case, it just happens to be Australia. Sure, we might be 2-0 up in the Ashes, and the moment we start to have a good day in the cricket, we start to have our Governor General coming out and saying, oh, maybe we should become a republic. And all this business. Imagine who will run the show if we became a republic. The crooks would literally have ownership. And that is really, really frightening. And therefore, our wealth would last in a heartbeat. But that's another story altogether. I think what we've got to look at, and what I want to have a look at today, is the fact that these icons that we call Qantas and Holden and so on and so forth, they actually represent the very identity of what it is to be an Australian. When you go overseas and you see a Qantas plane and the fleet, you start to relate to it and you start to say, hey, that's the flying kangaroo is what it is, partly to be an Australian. You also look at the Holden and Ford battle at Bathurst, and even that's been diluted. They're trying to dilute our identity. And they literally look at it and say, oh, now we're going to put in Mercedes and now we're going to put in Nissan. And even though they're not doing very well, it's diluting what was once an amazing race. And this is the sort of thing that I'm getting at. It's taking away your identity. So eventually people start, if they're willing to give up Qantas and they're willing to give up Holden, what else are people will they be willing to give up? And that's what I find quite scary. So when you think about it, we've gotten rid of Foster's, we've gotten rid of the Hills Hoist, we've gotten rid of Victor lawnmowers. In Australia, we've gotten rid of Aeroplane Jelly, we've gotten rid of Arnott's Biscuits, we've gotten rid of Myers, we've gotten rid of Tooheys Beer, and that's unheard of. We've gotten rid of OPSN, we've even gotten rid of our toilet paper, Sorbent. All of those brands, gone. People come in from overseas and they buy them up. And I actually find this a little bit disturbing, because all the icons that it used to employ Australians, owned by Australians, that used to sit on our Australian stock market, well, that's absolutely been bought up by foreign investors and foreign money linked to the globalists. Let's not forget, it's not like some rich guy is sitting overseas in some other country. No, all of this goes back to those same 147 companies. You can look it up in the New Scientist. It's scientifically proven where it all goes back to the same investment companies, and it all ends up back in the same globalist hands. That's where it's all being bought out for. And the reality of this situation, and the frightening part, is it's all being funneled that way. And they're purposely choosing things that we can link to, that we have pride in, that we have an affliction to, that we love. They want to take that away from us. Then they'll change the branding. They'll change the name. And that's why I believe we've really got to hang on to things like Qantas and employ Australians. We've got to hang on to something like Holden. And then we've got to be able to turn around if things do go pear-shaped overseas, and we've got to have them on the stock exchange. And our superannuation has got to be invested in these companies. And we as people, regardless of whether you've got to change what people are wearing on Qantas, or regardless of whether you've got to bring in some robots, I totally understand that's going to be the future. But it's got to be Australians that can turn around and say with pride, it's not all about patriotism, and say, Australians, I know somebody who made that car, and I'm proud to drive that car. I think that's the thing that they take away from you. They take away part of your humanity, and that seems to be the trick. And let's not forget, there was even talk very recently, and have a look at this article.
The Singapore Exchange wants to buy all of the shares in the ASX for $8.4 billion.
This is a matter for Wayne Swan, and Wayne Swan needs to explain to the Australian people how it is in our national interest to have the Australian Stock Exchange purchased entirely by the Singapore Stock Exchange.
Queensland Independent Bob Katter has attacked the proposal, arguing the exchange doesn't belong in foreign hands.
This piece of machinery will not be under the control of the Australian people. It'll be controlled and owned by somebody else. Now, if you sell the ASX, I'm just wondering, when we put the High Court of Australia up for sale.
So they wanted to move our Australian Stock Exchange, which holds the majority of all of our superannuation, and we do have an ageing population, over to Singapore. So is that the solution? Is the idea that you erode our sovereignty and then you move us over to some sort of EU-esque type Asian solution where we're just a part of a member state of some group of Asian nations that's lost all of its identities, lost all of its icons, that we no longer have any sort of connection to? That's the thing that I'm starting to see with very, very open eyes. So no, and I don't even drive a car, and I hardly travel overseas. So it's not like I'm some sort of, Qantas Club freak, although I don't mind the occasional beer there. And I'm not some sort of, Holden nut, don't get me wrong. Or Ford nut. And I understand these brands come from overseas. What's more important to me is the effect it's going to have on the Australian people and the Australian way of life. And I think that's something that we all desperately need to consider. And if the idea of a EU-type Asian setup is completely crazy, don't forget about this TPP, this Trans-Pacific Partnership with all the member states, where effectively the multinationals could effectively take over and funnel the money back to these globalists that way. Or they could just balkanise Australia. Remember in our referendum at the last election, they were literally trying to give more power to local governments and take it away from the state. So all of these things that I'm starting to see in the news is pointing to the fact that they want to take away or dissolve the very sovereignty of Australia, whilst taking away the identity from the Australian people. And these things are happening, not to mention the fact that they are relaxing our foreign ownership. So, of course, it starts on things like Qantas, and let's not forget that 1 in 8 houses are now actually bought by, Chinese families or Chinese investors.
Chinese developer bought this building behind me.
Sold.
This property was bought for $1.67 million.
Sold.
Flying in with suitcases of cash, foreign investors are seizing a slice of the Australian dream.
We are the lucky country, and that's why they're investing.
So they're coming in and actually buying houses, they're buying units, and of course they're buying rural farms. Now, I don't have a problem with it. But once you start selling your companies, once you start selling your farm...
Foreign buyers have snapped up 1 in every 8 new properties built this year. That's up from 1 in 20 2 years ago, according to research from the National Australia Bank. When you're bidding on behalf of a client and you're up against an Asian investor, what advice do you give?
I generally say to my client, today's not the day we're buying.
Australia's most valuable farm, Cubby Station, is now sold overseas, and in fact will be producing food for countries in the Asian area. And that, to me, is indicating this whole process that we are starting to not only lose our sovereignty, but we are in fact starting to lose our identity, and we are just serving other masters. And it's all happening right around us, but we tend to sort of compartmentalize it, so to speak, and we don't connect the dots. And I think it's time that we do start to literally connect the dots and see that our country, and this is happening to other countries too, is being taken away from under us. If you have a look at, say, Canada, for example, there's a lot of complaining going on throughout Europe, as we know, and of course in the UK. The other thing that I'm pretty concerned about is this idea that we are talking about promoting the Republic all of a sudden while all of this is going on. And of course, we could go on about our migration policies till the cows don't come home at Cubby Station because we've sold it. Because we're relaxing our migration policies and we're allowing lots of migrants to come in. So we're almost promoting the idea of multiculturalism whilst we're complaining about a couple of, 1,000 people coming in by boat, but we are letting in lots and lots and lots of people coming through the planes. And this, to me, is suggesting that we are well on our way to eroding the sovereignty of the Australian people. Whether you're for or against it, I'd love to get your opinion, but I think it's something that we've got to consider because the money isn't going to be going to other people. It's all being funded back to these investment companies and it's all being funded back to the globalists. And we will, in fact, lose the Australia that we once knew if we haven't lost it already. And I'm a believer that Australian citizens need to fight for their personal sovereignty. That's the thing that I'm really after. This is Brazy. Have yourself a great day.
We love football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars. Football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
That's football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
Football and meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
I think you better tell me again.
We love football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
In case you're wondering, this commercial is brought to you by football, meat pies, kangaroos and Australia's own car.
They go together underneath the southern stars. Football and meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars.
Makes sense to me.
Football, meat pies.